his place at the table in the White House where he's going to speak. Here now, the next picture will be the President of the United States.
How does a president go from the pinnacle of power to the brink of disgrace, bringing the nation to its knees in scandal? This is the story of Richard Nixon, a man who climbed to the top of American politics only to fall in a storm of lies, betrayal, and cover-ups. Was he a victim of a political witch hunt or the mastermind behind a conspiracy that tore America apart? How could a man who once seemed destined for greatness end up resigning in disgrace? What led to his historic resignation, and can a man ever truly redeem himself? Keep watching to find out. Richard Nixon's story is one that unfolds like a political thriller, full of ambition, controversy, and dramatic twists. Born on January 9, 1913, in Yorba Linda, California, Nixon was the second of 5 children in a modest family. His father, Frank, ran a service station and grocery store, while his mother, Hannah, was a devout Quaker whose faith deeply influenced young Richard. Nixon's sharp intellect earned him a spot at Whittier College, where he graduated in 1934 and later at Duke University Law School, finishing in 1937. But his heart wasn't all law. It found its match in Thelma Pat Ryan, a local teacher and actress. Their story began on a stage, acting together in a community play. For Nixon, it was love at first sight, though Pat needed convincing. After 2 years of his determined courtship, they married in 1940. When World War II broke out, Nixon answered the call, joining the Navy and serving in the Pacific. By the war's end, he had risen to lieutenant commander, a title that mirrored his rising determination. But it was politics where Nixon found his battleground. In 1946, he challenged and defeated long-standing Democratic Congressman Jerry Voorhis, hinting at communist ties, a tactic that displayed the combative style he would later perfect. By 1948, Nixon was a national figure, hunting alleged Soviet spies as part of the House Un-American Activities Committee. His grilling of Alger Hiss, a polished ex-diplomat accused of espionage, captivated the nation. Nixon's relentless pursuit, supported by ex-spy Whittaker Chambers' explosive testimony, ended with Hiss convicted of perjury, a dramatic win that cemented Nixon as America's anti-communist crusader. His rise had only just begun. How does a president go from the pinnacle of power to the brink of disgrace, bringing the nation to its knees in scandal? This is the story. Nixon's ascent continued. In 1950, he ran for the U.S. Senate against Helen Gahagan Douglas. His campaign took a sharp turn, distributing pink sheets, comparing her voting record to that of a far-left congressman. This earned him the nickname Tricky Dick, a name that would haunt him for years. But his journey to the presidency was a roller coaster of scandals, resilience, and political maneuvering that forever shaped American politics. In 1952, as Dwight D. Eisenhower's running mate, Nixon's fierce anti-communist stance made him a Republican star. But then came accusations of a secret slush fund, threatening to end his career. With his back against the wall, Nixon delivered the emotional Checkers speech. On live television, he spoke not just of politics, but of his modest life and a little cocker spaniel, Checkers, that his daughters adored. That heartfelt moment turned the tide, solidifying his place in the campaign and contributing to their landslide victory. As vice president, Nixon tirelessly campaigned but held limited influence over policy decisions. He gained prominence during Eisenhower's health crises, taking on leadership roles that hinted at his presidential ambitions. Internationally, he made waves during high-stakes trips, including a dramatic clash with Soviet Premier Khrushchev in the kitchen debate, which showcased his combative Cold War stance. The 1960 presidential race was Nixon's chance to shine, but it turned into a battle that defined him in unexpected ways. Facing the charismatic John F. Kennedy, Nixon relied on his experience, but the new era of televised debates changed the game. Under harsh studio lights, Kennedy's confident, polished demeanor stole the spotlight, leaving Nixon looking weary. The loss was razor-thin, with whispers of voter fraud in key states. Still, Nixon chose not to challenge the results, putting the nation's stability above his own ambitions. 2 years later, Nixon's bid for California governor ended in bitter defeat. Frustrated, he famously declared the press wouldn't have him to kick around anymore, signaling the end of his political career, or so it seemed. By 1968, with America swaying from trouble, Nixon returned, offering promises of law and order and an end to the Vietnam War. He organized an extraordinary comeback, reclaiming the political stage. With Spiro Agnew as his running mate, Nixon narrowly defeated Hubert Humphrey and George Wallace, reclaiming his career and stepping into the presidency. Now, Humphrey, the sitting vice president under Lyndon B. Johnson, was fighting an uphill battle. His campaign carried the heavy baggage of Johnson's unpopular Vietnam War policies. Desperate to shift the narrative, Humphrey called for an end to the bombing in North Vietnam, calling it an acceptable risk for peace. Then came a game-changing move. On October 31st, just days before the election, Johnson announced the bombing would stop to pave the way for peace talks with Hanoi. If this decision had come earlier, the election might have played out differently. Humphrey was closing the gap in polls, but it wasn't enough. Richard Nixon edged him out with 31.7 million votes to Humphrey's 30.9 million, capturing 301 electoral votes to Humphrey's 191. Now Nixon's presidency began under skepticism. Many thought he'd be a do-nothing leader. But Nixon surprised them with bold domestic reforms. Take his ambitious family assistance program, for example. It aimed to guarantee a minimum income for poor families, working or not. Although the Senate shut it down, the idea sparked reforms like supplemental security income for the elderly and disabled, and cost of living adjustments for Social Security. While programs like food stamps and Medicaid expanded under his watch, his approach to civil rights was conflicted. He introduced set-aside policies, paving the way for positive action, but reluctantly complied with court-mandated school desegregation, which dramatically reduced all black schools. But then what about the environmental front? Well, he established the Environmental Protection Agency and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, prioritizing worker and environmental safety. His new federalism initiative channeled federal funds to empower states, blending central authority with local autonomy, a move as sensible as it was political. But what was Nixon's toughest domestic challenge? Well, it was the economy. Inflation and unemployment were surging. In 1971, he rolled out the new economic policy, devaluing the dollar, imposing wage price controls, and adding import surcharges. These measures offered temporary relief, but by 1973, inflation roared back, hitting double digits. But let's move to Nixon's foreign affairs, starting with the Vietnam War, a conflict that shaped his presidency. Nixon's strategy, named as Vietnamization, aimed to gradually pull U.S. troops out of Vietnam, handing over combat responsibilities to South Vietnamese forces. But while they took on more fighting, they leaned heavily on American supplies and air support. Nixon didn't just scale back, he escalated too. He resumed bombing North Vietnam and extended the war into neighboring Cambodia and Laos. The spring of 1970 saw a bold move. U.S. and South Vietnamese troops launched attacks on North Vietnamese sanctuaries in Cambodia. Back home, the backlash was fierce. Protests erupted nationwide, none more tragic than the one at Kent State University on May 4th. Ohio National Guardsmen, in the middle of the chaos, opened fire on protesters, killing 4 students and wounding 9. Despite the trouble, Nixon pushed for peace with honor. After intense negotiations led by Henry Kissinger and North Vietnam's Le Duc Tho, a breakthrough seemed imminent in October 1972. Kissinger's declaration, "Peace is at hand," raised hopes. But the agreement faltered due to objections from South Vietnam. Nixon responded with the infamous Christmas bombings, an 11-day assault on Hanoi. Finally, in January 1973, a new peace accord was signed in Paris, calling for an immediate ceasefire, U.S. troop withdrawal, and prisoner exchanges. Kissinger and Tho earned the Nobel Peace Prize, though Tho declined it. Now, Nixon's diplomacy in the 1970s was a mix of cunning strategy and dramatic turns. His groundbreaking approach with China, partly a move to exploit the growing rift between China and the Soviet Union, gave him the upper hand in negotiations with the Soviets. By 1971, the USSR softened its stance toward the U.S., leading to Nixon's visit to Moscow in May 1972. This visit wasn't just symbolic. It produced 10 major agreements, including the historic SALT I treaties, the first steps toward controlling nuclear arms. A memorandum titled The Basic Principles of U.S.-Soviet Relations also emerged, marking the beginning of a more cooperative phase, known as détente. But Nixon's successes weren't universal. In the Middle East, his administration proposed the Rogers Plan, an ambitious peace initiative, but it was shot down by both Israel and the Soviets. After the Yom Kippur War in 1973, Nixon's Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, stepped up with shuttle diplomacy, darting between Arab nations and Israel. While these efforts secured some disengagement agreements, they didn't significantly mend U.S.-Arab relations. In Latin America, Nixon's tactics took a darker turn. Alarmed by the election of Chile's Marxist president Salvador Allende in 1970, Nixon's administration actively sought to destabilize his government. After Allende nationalized U.S.-owned mines, Nixon restricted Chile's access to economic aid, secretly backed the Chilean military, and funneled millions to opposition groups. By September 1973, the groundwork had been laid for a military coup led by General Augusto Pinochet, toppling Allende and plunging Chile into years of dictatorship. Meanwhile, back in the U.S., Nixon seemed untouchable, riding high after his 1972 landslide victory over Senator George McGovern. But was this triumph masking cracks in the foundation of his presidency? While Nixon celebrated his political dominance, dark clouds loomed on the horizon, setting the stage for a scandal that would redefine his legacy and shake the nation to its core. The victory was short-lived as the Watergate scandal unraveled his presidency. It began with a seemingly simple burglary at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate complex. But this was no petty crime. It was a political operation tied to Nixon's re-election team, involving former CIA operatives and secret cash payments to silence the burglars. Nixon himself orchestrated the cover-up, obstructing the FBI's investigation and trying to keep the truth buried. Major newspapers began to sniff out a trail, wondering if the White House itself could be tangled in the mess. Leading the charge were Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward, two relentless reporters from the Washington Post. Their stories had an edge, thanks to tips from a shadowy figure they called Deep Throat. The mystery of this informant became a story on its own, fueling speculation for decades until, in 2005, W. Mark Felt, a high-ranking FBI official, finally stepped forward as the mysterious whistleblower. By February 1973, the drama hit Capitol Hill. A special Senate committee led by Senator Sam Ervin was tasked with unraveling the Watergate affair. Televised hearings gripped the nation as John Dean, Nixon's White House counsel, dropped a bombshell. He accused the president himself of orchestrating the cover-up. Witnesses came forward, spilling tales of illegal activities that painted a sinister picture. Federal agencies used to intimidate Nixon's enemies, secret political spying missions, and a shady team called the Plumbers, special investigators digging into leaks that threatened the administration. Then came the twist that turned the case on its head. In July, the committee discovered that Nixon had wired the Oval Office with a recording system back in 1969. Every conversation was on tape. When Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox asked for the tapes, Nixon flat out refused to hand them over. Instead, he tried to offer summaries of what was on them, but Cox wasn't having any of it. Frustrated, Nixon triggered what's now called the Saturday Night Massacre. He ordered Attorney General Elliot Richardson to fire Cox. Richardson refused and resigned. His deputy, William Ruckelshaus, also refused and was promptly sacked. Finally, Solicitor General Robert Bork carried out Nixon's order and dismissed Cox. The chaos only added to the scandal, and a federal court later ruled Nixon's actions illegal. By this point, the noose was tightening. The tapes, the cover-up, and Nixon's defiance had turned Watergate from a burglary into a presidential downfall waiting to happen. As the walls closed in, Nixon tried to hold his ground. Facing impeachment calls, he appointed a new special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, assuring Congress he wouldn't fire him without their consent. In a press conference, he defiantly declared, "I am not a crook," but action spoke louder than words. Under pressure, Nixon handed over 7 of the 9 tapes originally requested, but one tape had a suspicious 18.5-minute gap, a silence that raised more questions than answers. The tapes hinted at wrongdoing but didn't yet provide the so-called smoking gun to directly connect Nixon in the break-in or its cover-up. Jaworski wasn't satisfied. He subpoenaed 64 more tapes, but Nixon clung to them, citing executive privilege. The legal fight escalated to the Supreme Court, which unanimously ruled in July 1974 that Nixon couldn't withhold the tapes. Meanwhile, the House Judiciary Committee recommended 3 articles of impeachment, accusing Nixon of obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and defying congressional subpoenas. Then came the tape from June 23, 1972. In it, Nixon discussed using the CIA to block the FBI's investigation into the Watergate break-in. This was it, the smoking gun. With his guilt undeniable and impeachment looming, Nixon addressed the nation on August 8, 1974, announcing his resignation, effective the following day. He became the first U.S. president to resign, leaving the Oval Office to his successor, Gerald Ford, who had stepped in as vice president after Spiro Agnew resigned in the middle of corruption charges. A month later, Ford pardoned Nixon, sparing him criminal prosecution but sparking national controversy. Nixon retreated to his California estate, where he focused on writing memoirs like R.N., the Memoirs of Richard Nixon, and books on foreign policy, gradually repairing his image as a diplomatic mind. In his later years, Nixon campaigned for U.S. support for Russia after the Soviet Union's collapse. On April 22, 1994, Nixon passed away after a massive stroke, just months after losing his wife, Pat. Despite his tarnished legacy, leaders like Bill Clinton acknowledged his significant diplomatic achievements. He was buried next to his wife, Pat, at the place where his story began, leaving behind a legacy that divided opinions but remains unforgettable in American history. What do you think led to Nixon's downfall in the end? His mistakes or the actions of those around him? And if you were in Nixon's shoes, would you have challenged the 1960 election results after the close race? Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. Thank you for watching. We'll see you guys soon.